Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our latest episode of Diary of a CIO. I'm Sarah Pawson of the Fruition group, and really delighted to welcome our guest today, Paul Edwards. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, thanks, Sarah.
Thanks so much for joining me. As always, I'll give a quick intro to our guest and then we'll delve into some questions. So Paul is a seasoned technology leader with 25 years experience leading transformation across multiple different sectors, including media, finance and consultancy. Currently CTO at Ansor, a private equity firm focused on acquiring SMEs in fragmented high growth markets. And Paul brings quite a unique background with a blend of product and engineering leadership to the table, and has helped shape digital strategies for organisations, build delivery capability for brands such as Channel 4, BT Sport, Pret A Manger, and his consultancy experience and digital. Also has a very busy life outside of work, to two kids, going through secondary school at the moment, and a busy sports coaching career as well in football and cricket, whilst trying to keep fit and sane at the same time by doing some running as well. So yeah, big welcome. Hopefully I've covered everything off there about you, Paul. Anything I've missed?
Great, thank you very much. No, nothing.
Good stuff. So we'll talk at the beginning, if that's okay, about your career journey and leadership. And I always start with the same questions, because I find this really insightful of people's journeys and little stories. Was there a kind of a pivotal moment in your career where you realised you wanted to become a CTO? And was there a crossroads that you reached where you had to make a decision to get that?
Not really. No, I think I was, so straight out of university, I joined a financial services startup called Complinet that was later acquired by Thomson Reuters. It was kind of late 90s, not a time when startups were particularly common. And it was great. It was a great learning experience. It was a brilliant start in a career. And I found myself going into a leadership position because of the age of the business. I found myself in a leadership position kind of relatively early on. And actually at the time, I kind of didn't find it particularly comfortable. And probably for next 5, 6, 7 years after that role, I actually avoided leadership positions. I actually kind of deliberately went into roles where I wouldn't have any sort of responsibility for leadership. I think I found it quite challenging.
Okay.
And probably hadn't been prepared or ready for that level of responsibility, I suppose. In terms of actually kind of seeking out this type of role, I think it's just come naturally, as it were. I think the roles and the experience that I've had, particularly in the last 10 years of consulting, I think I started to feel that I wasn't really getting a bit frustrated without the kind of, you don't have the authority, the autonomy, the responsibility to kind of make those decisions. You're going and giving advice to people and they can either take it or leave it in a lot of cases with consulting. So as a sort of direct, I sat down and planned out my career. No, probably not. But I think over time, I've become more comfortable with the idea of that role.
Amazing. And you've recently stepped into a new CTO seat, Ansor. Is that the first time they've had a CTO?
Yes. Yeah.
Amazing. And obviously, private equity organisation, your first experience working in the PE world.
Yeah.
How's that going, and what's been your focus in your first few months as a CTO in an organisation that hasn't had somebody operating at that level before?
It's great. I think one of the things that attracted me to private equity and this type of company was that they're very outcome driven. Going back to consulting again, I think a lot of businesses that you talk to, you can sometimes find that they're not necessarily driven by an outcome. Often lots of big companies with big wheels to turn around projects and things almost lose sight of what the outcome or the point is of the work they're doing. And I've actually found times I've spoken to people and asked them that exact question of why are you doing what you're doing, and it's a surprisingly large number who sort of scratch their heads and say we're not really sure, we were kind of told to, or there's even differing opinions about why they're doing that work. What's great about private equity world is there's a clear outcome. We want to, buy really good businesses and then help them improve through the use of technology, in particular in my role, so that they become, more efficient, more effective, potentially grow their markets or even go out to new customers, etc., which is great. So it's really clear, and all the decisions that you then make, you can sort of hang off of that outcome and that goal, and it becomes much clearer in a sense in terms of decision making. I think for Ansor, it's a really good time for them to get a CTO. I think I'm currently helping both the kind of existing portfolio businesses, but also the new ones that we're looking to start up and invest in with their technology strategies. And actually, we're already seeing some of the benefits of that, which is great.
It's really interesting you said that. I was speaking to another CTO on a podcast yesterday. He said exactly the same thing about the most enjoyable roles are when either an organization has really clear outcomes or they're absolutely laser focused on what that business needs to deliver. Yeah. And so many organizations miss that point and miss that, is the vision and strategy clear? Is it communicated to the teams? And I guess with private equity, you've got that in spades in terms of really clear strategy.
Yeah.
Does that become more blurry though once you get into the weeds in the portfolio organizations that you're going to be supporting? How do you keep that focus?
You've got to cascade it down. I think one of the things I've started internally is to make sure that we get the information. There's obviously a strategy behind, there's a very, well thought through strategy behind the setting up of each of the businesses or the purchasing of each of the businesses. It's translating that into something that you can then sort of build a technology strategy out of. It's a bit of a cliche, but the technology should be the enabler. It shouldn't be the driver. It shouldn't be the thing that everyone's chasing after. So making sure that we sit down with the people who have come up with that business strategy and start to define things like, what's the operating model of these businesses? Who are their customers? How do they make money at a very basic level? What are the things that are preventing them from making more money or finding new customers, etc.? And then looking at ways that technology can help and enable that. So you're always tying the technology strategy back to the actual business goals. And I think as I've sort of become more senior in my career, I've increasingly found that to be so important, and it just helps on so many different factors. I think it keeps teams aligned on the work, because everyone should be working towards the same goal, even if they're doing different things, working in maybe slightly different sectors. Everyone should still have that overall shared sort of business objective that they can work to, and it just means you've got a sort of a central point with which you can have conversations around, which your reporting can be based around, etc. Yeah, I'd keep going back to consulting and saying the number of times you find that companies have somehow lost that along the way. And so you sometimes find technology teams working at odds with what the business are actually trying to achieve.
Yeah. And your career started in a more product focused role, which then led you on to product leadership and into technology leadership. How has that background shaped your approach as a CTO?
I think it's essential. I think when I think of the sort of best engineering teams that I've worked with, or the best individuals who are, software engineers, they all have a product mindset. And I think, these sort of terms get sort of banded around quite a lot, and people rebadge these things on LinkedIn and kind of make a big deal out of it. But actually, the basics of thinking about the user need, thinking about what the software needs to do, how you're going to test it, how you're going to measure it, what success looks like from the perspective of the person who's going to ultimately end up using that tool, I think is just a thread that goes through all of product development. And that's whether you're building a product in software or something else. I think it's just a really, and like I say, all the best people I've worked with have all just had that kind of naturally, doesn't matter what role they're in. So I don't think it's really changed my approach as a CTO. I think it's always kind of been there, but I do probably prefer working with people who have that similar mindset.
Yeah. And you've also worked across fairly contrasting sectors, from media to consulting and now private equity. Are there any kind of common, I guess, leadership lessons that have kind of I guess, stuck with you through the different transitions across these industries? Does it matter where, you know, or do you have to apply different approaches in a different sector?
I think, well, one of them would be to take time to learn the context of the particular business. I think, you know, the easiest mistake to make is to think you have all the answers when you go in, when you're confronted with a particular problem in a particular business, to assume you've got the answers, maybe because that business is similar to one that you've worked in before. And that's a trap. You know, the best consultants I've ever seen, or leaders that I've worked with, will take time to listen and take time to kind of really understand what the problem is that's being solved, and often why it needs to be solved. You know, often people just see a problem and go straight in with the solution without really understanding what the history of that problem is. Because up until that point, all the decisions that were made may have been the right ones, but just the context might have changed.
And coming on to challenges and industry trends, and just a little bit more about your current role, where I guess you're focusing on acquiring and combining SME organizations that you're, I guess, integrating not only at a brand level, but a complete business level. What are the biggest technical challenges that you face when integrating and then when scaling these businesses?
I think the thing that has really the thing that probably took me by surprise, having come from businesses that are pretty technically mature, you know, companies that are very comfortable with digital products, digital tools. A lot of the SMEs that we work with are incredible specialists in their own fields, but often aren't particularly mature in, you know, the world of in technology and that technology use. So it's kind of not using those assumptions, and it's almost going from 0 to 1, and that challenge of going from 0 to 1 being actually quite big. Just even getting people onto sort of common finance tools, etc. And then once you're there, then the scaling can happen. And I think making sure that kind of shared tools are in place, that the data maturity is there. I think a lot of the companies we're looking at, just trying to get a consistent set of data across from day one, really, so that actually that allows you to get the insight to scale. And once you got that in place, scaling should be less friction.
And how long does that integration take, or is that just a how long's a piece of string question?
Yeah, it depends.
On
the company, really, and it depends on what the company has. I think, you know, if the company is actually just pretty much running off of Google Sheets, for example, it's probably easier to integrate them than it is if they've already got a load of legacy tech built up. So those are the two kind of two extremes.
And even when there's legacy technology built up, is there a rip the plaster off point you reach? Or
I think
does that happen? Is that how it works?
Yeah, I think so. You know, there's always the temptation to delay and push things, you know, kick the can down the road. But what we've definitely learned is that the sooner everyone can get integrated, the better. It just makes life much easier for everyone. It also allows you to mention scaling. It also allows you to have, you know, look at where you can have those kind of shared things across the businesses, in terms of potentially sharing customers, sharing data, potentially sharing, you know, other sort of systems, and looking at new opportunities. If you have one business that maybe 1 month is down on its inventory, whereas another one is overbooked, you might be able to kind of switch those things across. But until everyone's on a shared platform, it's very hard to see those sorts of opportunities.
Yeah. And then you've helped companies respond to high pressure environments and scenarios and situations outside of your current role. You mentioned, you know, supporting Pret during COVID and other things where businesses like that were really impacted. How do you approach making a decision as a tech leader when speed and impact are absolutely critical and getting it right?
Oh, yeah. I think the most stressful projects I've worked on have been ones where the deadline couldn't shift. So I had the Paralympics for London 2012, where obviously there was no way that the deadline was going to shift for that. And equally, when I moved to BT Sport, when we were building out the supporting app, and the Premier League was the first match in the Premier League that season was our deadline, you know, and they're not going to move the Premier League back just because we haven't, you know, built out the infrastructure in time. So it's really a management of scope. But it's equally a really just always a communication challenge. And I think what I've found throughout my career is when things get, tense and stressful, and communication becomes even more important, and clear communication, and being able to make sure that everyone who needs that information has it in a format and a way that they can really understand. And I think sometimes that's a mistake people make. They will sort of blurt out comms, but haven't gone through the process of really identifying how to communicate that concisely with all the information that people need, so that ultimately it becomes a trust game, that people trust that things are in control. Just the moment that trust is lost, when people start to intervene, sometimes that means that actually things take longer. It's always, I think lots of people have probably seen that when stressful situations occur.
So always better for you to have a fixed deadline that's immovable. And
I wouldn't say that. I think sometimes it helps. I think sometimes it helps to focus minds. And personally, in those two situations, I like to think I used the fixed deadline as a sort of leverage, I suppose, or it allowed me to be able to trade things off. So, there was, you obviously have a finite amount of people to do the work, finite amount of time to do that work within, and there's a fixed deadline. So it allowed me to kind of negotiate around priorities in particular. People always want everything all at once, but it made me able to say, well, actually, just the reality is you're not going to get everything you want. So let's have a grown-up conversation about what really is important. It also allowed me to focus the delivery itself. So starting with the most important thing, building out the most important feature with a kind of mindset that I've sort of tried to carry on, which is always think your project's going to get cancelled next week, because then that allows you to focus on the most important thing. So can you take away out of this something that works, as opposed to people who have spent a lot of time on the scaffolding or the various things that actually aren't that valuable, and they've missed out on the core functionality or the core value of a particular product.
And when you're building innovation capability, and we talked about always thinking your project's going to get canned, or building out an MVP, what's your approach for ensuring speed, focusing on that without sacrificing on the long-term scalability of whatever it is you're building?
I think all of the sort of modern practices that have evolved, that have become right at the root of everything all the good things that are out there in terms of ways of working, sort of come back to a number of the same factors, really, in terms of breaking really clear prioritization. So really kind of understanding the value of the work that you're doing and the building blocks, breaking those down into really small pieces of work that don't take weeks and weeks and weeks to complete, but preferably a day or two. Having that kind of test and feedback loop is super important. And then all of the good practices around things like limiting the work in progress of a particular team or cohort, testing, and just good hygiene practices around continuous delivery, test-driven development. I think when you get those things in place and they're working, and you work with a team that has operated really well with those, with that sort of mindset, it's amazing. It's a really amazing thing to see. And I've seen it, a few times in my career where I've been fortunate enough to work with a team that is just running at, 120%, 150%, and they are just an amazing thing to watch. The flow just happens. And at that point, it becomes, again, another easy thing to communicate, because you're constantly telling people a good story about what's happening, what is actually being delivered. And then the conversation becomes a much easier conversation about changing priorities or changing focus based on feedback that you get. I think the alternative is the kind of old-fashioned way of long-term projects that aren't particularly well prioritized, where you're waiting 3, 6, 7 months to see some output. Those are the challenging ones.
And is there a kind of trend in the product or tech space that you're seeing that you think more leaders should be paying attention to right now, but aren't yet? What's kind of the next innovation that you should be thinking about?
In innovation, I mean, obviously the world is just sort of obsessed with AI at the moment. I think my take on what product and tech leaders should be doing with that is, I suppose I'm I'm a bit of a pragmatist on it. I suppose I'm a sort of slightly cynical realist, that I've seen so many new technologies and new hype that, come and go. People telling us that the world's going to change, that we're not going to need software engineers anymore, that we're not going to need, product people anymore. And these things never come to fruition. I think AI is an incredibly interesting and powerful thing, but I'd be careful to not jump in too soon. We're still very early days, even though we're sort of 18 months, 2 years after ChatGPT came out. I think being careful about who you take your advice off and who you listen to. I think one of the rules I always have is, look at people, have they done their homework and are they publishing their thinking? And there are some great people out there that you can follow who, are talking really intelligently about new emerging technologies and particularly AI, but they're also publishing their working, how they've gone through that thought process, as opposed to just saying this thing's a game changer, and those two things are very different. So yeah, and that then obviously the challenge for most product and technology leaders isn't actually the understanding of it, it's how you communicate with other stakeholders. And it's just taking, I think, those lessons into your communications with other stakeholders of saying, if you've got a CEO who is kind of shooting for the moon and you're not quite sure that AI is the answer, just making sure that you show your homework and show your working and show why you don't think it's that thing.
Right. We've got lots of CEOs who are, AI is on the agenda. We've got to tick this box, particularly in the private equity world, right? It's a big value driver in an organization. And how does a business start? How do they, they've got to do something. The CEO is demanding it's happening. How do they start to consider using AI in their business to prove either way that there's an opportunity within that business?
Yeah, it's a number of different factors. I think who have you got to work on it is the first thing, and how much money have you got to spend on it? I used to think that chatbots were a waste of time, and that might be quite controversial, but I most of the chatbots, people about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, everyone seemed to be talking about building out chatbots, and there's a number of different factors to consider there. One is obviously, does it actually give any benefit to the customer? And in a lot of cases, these chatbots weren't integrated with any other systems, so actually they were pretty useless. So if you wanted to actually find out sort of your flight details or something on an airline website, they hadn't actually plumbed it into the back end, so actually it couldn't give you that information. At which point you think, well, not sure this is more useful than having a human being who can actually look that thing up and talk to me. So that was a bit of a negative. I think, really understanding what the need is. So where are, hopefully the companies that I work with, we're getting to the point where we talk to the people who really understand those businesses from, back to front, who have maybe even built up those businesses from scratch, understand the market, understand the industry. And from those conversations, you can really start to identify, where is AI going to come in here and have a kind of a 10 times effect. Just sort of scratching the surface with things like, chatbots doesn't do that. It's never going to kind of get you any sort of 10 times uplift on efficiency or customer service or revenue or anything. So, it's understanding where the needs of the business are and then actually putting proper money behind it and proper resource behind it to actually do a good job. And I think what we've probably seen in the last year and a half is people not doing that. They've been a little bit scared to put too much investment in. So actually what's happened is they've not really done anything. They've spent money on just kind of scratching the surface.
And have you seen a good chatbot in use?
No,
changed?
Or at least I've not used one that I've felt kind of really changed, the way I do things. I use AI every day for lots of different sort of daily tasks. But in terms of kind of customer service or those sort of service level tools, I've not yet come across anything that's really kind of blown me away yet.
Yeah, I felt the same. And then this week I used the Co-op insurance, motor insurance chatbot, and it was just exceptionally good because it actually gave me what I wanted. Obviously, because it was doing exactly what you said. It was linking into their business systems, and I was trying to get evidence of my no claims discount, and it just worked brilliantly. And it's the first time I've ever had a positive experience. So not that I'm sure anyone from the Co-op insurance is listening, but if they are, it was really good.
And I think those things are going to happen, as as companies have had more time, because it's a lot of work. I think people maybe overestimated how much work it is to actually integrate these things with legacy systems, whilst also taking into account, privacy, security, etc. And they're probably going to start seeing, more of those things appearing now. But certainly the ones up until this point probably haven't had enough time to actually fully integrate with anything that makes them actually, super useful.
And what's the biggest challenge ahead for you looking forward to the next 12 months? What's going to keep you up at night, do you think?
Just the pace of change. We're building new businesses at an incredible rate of change. And while that's incredibly exciting, it also means, juggling quite a few things and just making sure that, we get the right decisions made early on. And we're not leaving those till too late in the day, because I think the longer you leave them, the more costly they're going to be to make those changes. So equally, if we make the wrong decisions now, they're going to be, more costly as the businesses scale to undo those decisions. So those are the things that kind of, they don't keep me up at night, but they're the things that, I think about a lot.
And you've led product tech strategies for organizations, both startups and kind of enterprise sort of context level. How do you approach setting technology strategies for your portfolio businesses when pace and the ability to scale quickly is so pressured and so focused? How do you do that? How do you approach it?
I think keeping it simple. I think the one of the best lessons about technology strategy and overall strategy I had was from the Paralympics, where I was very fortunate to inherit work that had been done for the bid, to win the bid for Channel 4 to get the coverage of the Paralympics. And it was a brilliant document. And that on page 1, you had the 5 promises that Channel 4 were making to the organising committee. And they included things like half of the presenters would have some sort of disability. You had just relatively straightforward ones, like they would broadcast more hours than ever before. And there were a couple more. And they cascaded down to the technology strategy. So everything we decided, so everything from prioritization to the suppliers we selected to the projects that we ran, we could tie them all back to those 5 principles. And we were able to always kind of keep referring back to them and on a regular basis check that we were on track. And it was relatively, like I said, it was only 5 things. And so for each of the businesses to have a small number of kind of guiding principles, I suppose, in terms of, what do the businesses do, who their customers are, what we're going to do for those customers, what type of business we want to be, how those different businesses operate with each other. I think having all of those things in place, and it doesn't have to be a 100-page document of things. It just gives you a kind of a reference point that you can keep coming back to as things get a high pace and potentially stressful. You've got a source of truth that you can constantly refer back to, and hopefully everyone understands those things as well, and they are written in a way that isn't technology specific but is understandable by the whole business, and actually hopefully is driving decisions in the rest of the business as well.
I guess it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, is having a business that has a really clear vision and strategy, and that's really well communicated to the relevant teams, and everyone's focused on delivering the same outcomes is really important. I guess having the right people to do all of that around you is key. And when you're acquiring a business, I guess you have less control over the individuals that you will end up in your teams, which I can imagine there's the whole heap of challenges that comes with that. I know you've built high-performing teams from scratch, as well as inheriting teams. What's your approach on building that team culture in an organisation where you are having to merge or integrate businesses with different cultures and different types of people?
I take the learnings from the fact I've been incredibly fortunate in my career to work with quite a few incredible teams who not only were sort of super productive and highly valued within those businesses, but also just really nice to be around and really nice to work with. And I know I've worked with teams that weren't like that, but the ones that really stand out for me are the ones where it was kind of a joy to come into work and work with those people, and they were incredibly diverse. I think of a particular team that I worked with about 10 years ago. Half of the team, there was a 50-50 gender split. We had people from all over the world. The roles were very equal. Even the sort of leadership was relatively flat within the team. And I often think of what were the things that kind of made that team as good as they were, because they were way more productive than everyone else in the sort of the same area, really. And I think there was just a huge level of trust between the different members in that team. And that built up, that wasn't because we did any sort of exercises or workshops or kind of deliberately came in and sort of went, right, we're going to work on trust this week. It just happened over time through certain behaviors, and just kind of, the people were being nice, people were just being nice to each other. I think everyone, there was a real benefit to the fact that everyone had a clear shared goal within this team. It was very well understood. Then the ways of working were actually driven by the team themselves. So it wasn't me coming in and saying, this is how everyone's got to operate. I came in at a time when actually the team was at a bit of a low point, but I just tried to work with what they had and just adjust things subtly and, look at where the problems were, but not do a kind of massive overhaul. We're very fortunate in having, 2 tech leaders within the team who are absolutely incredible and were willing to give their time to other members of the team to help and support them. But I needed to free their time up first in order to do that, because they were being dragged off into things that they shouldn't have been getting dragged off into. So I took that, and then they had time to kind of help the rest of the team. Again, another thing that kind of built up trust within the team, that those leaders were able to kind of give their time and pull everyone else up to their level. And then there was just other things like, giving the team time to just spend time with them away from their desks, just spending kind of 15-20 minutes every morning just to go as a team and have a coffee and just have a chat. Really small things, but they kind of make a really, really big impact, I think. So yeah, and I'm looking to bring that sort of approach to what I'm doing now.
And how do you build that trust when you're integrating teams and businesses? Because immediately when a business is acquired or integrated, there is going to be an element of concern and worry with the individuals in the team. It's just human nature. How do you go about building that trust when you haven't created the team and you're bringing teams together?
The shared outcome is one thing. So being really clear on what, why we're bringing these teams on board, why we're bringing these companies on board as part of the overall business, and it should be a positive message. The reason why we're acquiring these businesses is because they're good, and it should be sort of building up that sense of value, that we value their expertise, and again bringing some of those sort of consulting approaches where we're not walking in and telling everyone they have to change on day one in a lot of places. We're not going in and telling people they have to completely change the way their business operates. Hopefully showing through good communication that any changes we are making for their benefit as well as the rest of the business, if possible getting their buy-in as well. So actually, if we are choosing if we have identified that there's a new technology that needs to come in or could be used for certain things, using their expertise and maybe putting a team together from different people from different businesses to actually support on that selection process. So actually they're heavily involved and they've got buy-in to that. It's all things like that, really. I think just the danger is doing things at arm's length and kind of making decisions from on high without kind of talking to people, getting to know them, actually going and visiting the businesses, and so they know who they can talk to.
And I know you're really passionate about developing people and teams, and that kind of coaching and mentoring part is, I guess, is key as a technology leader. How do you help develop people in your team whilst also delivering when it's high stakes? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, I think sometimes the two things go hand in hand. I think you can't deliver at pace and high quality if you're also not helping people develop. I think the short-term approach is too often that you have to do everything yourself. You can't give time to mentor or coach because this thing's so important, it just needs to get done. And I think I think there is sometimes a discipline of saying these things are so important. Mentoring someone else to kind of, or supporting someone else to get better at what they do is actually more important than maybe some of the lower priority things on your list of things that you have to do yourself. And actually raising up the importance of that role is just so much better for the medium and long term. And sometimes it does look like it takes away from the short term, but I think proper smart prioritization shouldn't actually cause that to be a problem. And as leaders, sometimes we have to kind of make time for that and just really be protective of that time and not fall into the trap of doing stuff ourselves, which actually might be better just to pair with someone, get one of the more junior members to work with you on a particular thing. It might take a little bit more time to complete, but ultimately the long-term benefits are huge.
Yeah. So it's just keeping a focus on what you need to deliver short term is all well and good, and that's your business pressures. But for something to be scalable, you've got to develop people and be focused on that. And do you carve out time for that to ensure that happens? Are you quite strict about that?
I try and be as open as possible to people asking for help, but often it's a case of identifying someone who needs maybe support because they don't always ask for help, and making sure that you're in a place where you're not necessarily just giving unsolicited advice, but you're actually you're helping someone go through the process of coming up with a solution themselves and then supporting them in developing that solution. So I don't want to be someone just firing off kind of this is how you do it, but actually pairing with someone and actually talking them through why they're doing it a certain way, and a lot more sort of a coaching approach, I suppose.
Just to kind of come on to personal growth and advice really for people that will be listening today, and I know as we've talked about, that kind of providing that coaching and mentoring is really important to you. Is there a kind of a standout kind of person in your career that's acted as a mentor to you, that's helped guide and shape your career? I'm assuming there might be a few people, but are there any standout people and why?
Yeah, there's a few. Gosh, so the first ever CEO I worked for, a guy called Chris Pilling, who's gone on to chair a lot of businesses now. He was just fantastic in the sense of his focus and he was incredibly innovative about how he thought about things, and that has just stayed with me, particularly in the sort of later parts of this later part of my career, when the way he the way he spoke to people, the way he worked with people in different roles, whilst at the same time being really open to new ways of doing things is huge. Ryan Sikorsky, who's one of the founders at Equal Experts, has been a really good mentor and friend of mine for a number of years. And again, just the way he works with people and the way he communicates and the way he just has a great sense of empathy is a massive one for me as well.
It's interesting, everything you talk about and you've talked about today is ultimately it's not complicated, is it? It's about treating people as human beings and supporting people and kind of looking after people as they go through their career and journey and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes that empathy is lacking in technology leaders. How do you make sure that you as an individual keep up to date with ways of working, but also your management and leadership style? How do you do that?
I mean, I'm always looking. I've been very fortunate that I built up a really good network and able to call on advice, call on opinions. And just learn from people all the way through my career. I've been very fortunate to work with very diverse teams that I've been able to learn from, and I'm still learning. One of the reasons I'm so excited about the role I've got at the moment is I've got an opportunity to learn from people that I haven't worked with before in a totally new field. And actually, I found since the start of the year, I've been sort of building up a completely new network, or sort of an additional, new set of because people who have worked in this industry for quite a while, or some of the businesses that we're acquiring are a completely different set of people with different career paths that I've come across before. So that's really exciting, and it's just kind of being open, I suppose, to learn from whoever you come across.
I think the last couple of years has really taught everyone the value of having a network, not just a network when you need it, is really, really important. So it's interesting that whilst you're in a new role, you've still put the effort and investment into doing that, when actually that's probably way down on your priority list, but having the time to do that is so important.
Yeah.
I guess just to wrap up the session, obviously there'll be lots of budding technology professionals watching and listening today, hopefully. And, many at that point in their career where they're on their kind of career trajectory and about to start a technology leadership role or a kind of move into a C-level leadership role. What's the one piece of advice you wish you'd had from the start?
Yeah, I was actually talking to my daughter about this the other week. I think knowing what you can control. I think if I took myself back all the way to the kind of start of my career, and I think of the times when I was either stressed or lost sleep or was finding things difficult, I think if I was able to sort of map them out now and then sort of score them against whether I was actually in control of the outcome or not, I would find actually in most situations, the thing I was stressed about, I didn't have any control over. And so, knowing what you can control and really focusing on that. And actually, if it's outside of your control, trying not to worry about it too much, because there's only so much you can really do. It's kind of a bit like technical architecture, right? If you're in a team that has, certain boundaries and you can only change what's within those boundaries, stuff happening on the outside, well, you can't really do much about that. You have to just make sure that the stuff you do is as good, within your control is as good as possible. And not worry too much about what goes on outside of that.
So control the controllables.
Exactly. Yeah, much more succinct way to put it.
Absolutely. But great advice, not just as a tech professional, but in life as well.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you were relating that to your teenage daughter, is she doing her GCSEs imminently?
Next year, but starting all the
prep, and that thinking is really important.
Exactly.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time out, Paul. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for your time. It's been a really insightful episode.
Thanks, Sarah. Really enjoyable.